What's the best news you've ever heard?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to session 4 of the One Life course live here at Minchinbury Anglican Church. My name is Mike Smith. I'm the senior minister here at the church, a church that exists to love Jesus and to show Jesus love. Well, over the last few Monday nights, we have been exploring life, faith, and meaning, and where Jesus Christ from the Bible fits into all of that. We've looked at the identity of Jesus. We've looked at the mission of Jesus. Tonight, we are zooming in on the cross of Christ. The cross is that pivotal event in all of the biographies of Jesus. And tonight, we're going to spend some time exploring what that means for us all. So thanks so much for tuning in on YouTube or Facebook tonight, whether that's live. And if you're watching this on the rebroadcast, great that you could be with us as well. Why don't you let us know that you watched, put a comment there, and if you have a question, I'd love to be able to answer that for you. If you're watching live right now, why don't you let us know that you're here and where you're watching from. And again, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me tonight, then put that in the comments there. Good evening, Bruce. It's good to see that you're here, and thanks, Bruce, for tuning in each and every Monday night. I hope that you've been finding the talks encouraging, helpful, insightful, and that you've been some learning things as well. So thanks, Bruce, again for being here tonight. Who else is here? Why don't you let us know in the comments there. I've already put a question in the comments that we're going to wrestle with tonight. You know, over the last few weeks, we've seen that Jesus is so powerful. He can do so many crazy things. He can still a storm with his voice, but we're going to see tonight that he still died on a cross. So why could a man who could still a raging storm with just his voice not step off a cross if he wanted to? I wonder what your answer to that question is. Why do you think Jesus died? Why don't you let us know in the comments below? I'd love to hear what you think on that topic. Or if you have any other questions about life, faith, meaning, the Bible, Jesus, God, the universe, I'd love to be able to help you with that tonight as well. But let's dive into our content for this evening as we think about the cross. But I want to start by talking about video games. It's a funny place to start, but let me tell you why. Because when I was a teenager, I loved playing video games. And if I'm honest, I still love playing video games. Now it's with my kids and trying to keep my competitive juices going. And if I can beat my kids at Mario Kart, it is a wonderful day. Now, there are some video games that you can play for like 20 minutes and you're satisfied and that's it. But then there are other video games that you just get hooked on, isn't there? And that you can spend countless hours just playing the game. And sometimes you don't even know how many hours have passed. You just get so engrossed in the game. Why don't you let us know in the comments, what's the longest you have ever played a video game? You know, was it Fortnite and you played for like 15 hours straight or whatever it might be? Why don't you let us know there in the comments below? But it can be hazardous to your health, can't it? Spending lots of time in front of the screen. I know we're trying to encourage our kids at the moment in lockdown here in Western Sydney to have some screen-free time as well, because it can be dangerous. And I read this tragic story that came out of South Korea a number of years ago. A 28-year-old man collapsed after playing StarCraft at an internet cafe for almost 50 hours straight. 50 hours playing a video game. The news report said that he died of heart failure stemming from increased blood pressure and exhaustion. Now, how do you respond to a story like that? When I read it, my initial response is, what? Wow, you know, how can anyone play a game with their life like that? But of course, we don't need to worry too much or think too hard about it, because we know lots of people play games with their life all the time. I don't know if you're a bit of a YouTube fan, but I've been following this YouTube channel called People Are Awesome. And there are people on that channel that play games with their life every single day. The video channel is about people doing just crazy things like, base jumping and jet ski flipping and ultimate parkour, jumping from building to building. Crazy things, playing games with their life. If you think that there's a mantra that kind of summarizes their purpose in life, it would be YOLO, right? You only live once. Now, it is true that you only live once, but it's also true that you only die once. And no matter what you think about your life now, no matter what you think about God, after you die, you will have to stand before God, says the Bible, and give an account for the life that you live. So let me ask you a question. Are you ready to meet God? I think there are so many people that think that they might be ready to meet God or unsure whether they're ready to meet God. And there might be some people that definitely know they are not ready to meet God. What about you? Are you ready to meet God? Well, tonight, as a result of our exploration, you can be ready to meet God because of what Jesus has done on that cross for you. Now, I want to spend some time tonight reading Mark's biography, his account of Jesus' death on the cross. As I said, all of the biographers of Jesus spend extensive amounts of time talking about Jesus' death because it is really the heart of what Jesus came to do for us. So let me read Mark's account of Jesus' death on the cross. Mark says this. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Now, as we think about the death of Jesus, it's hard not to imagine that horrible moment that the nails were hammered into his hands and his feet as he hung on the cross. We know that movies have been made about the death of Jesus. And it's hard not to imagine the pain, the physical pain that he must have gone through. And whilst Mark does mention something of the physical pain in Jesus' experience, Mark doesn't dwell on it. In fact, Mark wants us to see something more than just the physical pain of Jesus' death. There was a deeper reality going on, a deeper spiritual reality that Mark wants us to see. And I want to show you that tonight. 3 things from that chapter that show a deeper spiritual reality to Jesus' death. And if we understand this, this is what will enable us to be able to be ready to stand before God at the end of our life. 3 things. The eclipse, the cry, and the curtain. Firstly, there is the eclipse. And we can see it in verse 33, this strange thing that happened. At noon, whilst Jesus is hanging on the cross, darkness came over the whole land until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, at that moment when the sun was at its highest point and brightest point in the sky, darkness came over the whole land for 3 hours. This eclipse, this solar eclipse. Now, we see solar eclipses every now and again, but they generally don't last longer than, 5 or 6 minutes. But this one lasted for 3 hours. Something different was happening. Something cosmic and significant was happening. Now, if you know your Bible at all, you will know that light and darkness in the Bible is symbolic of good and evil. And so we're meant to see that when darkness comes over the whole land for 3 hours, somehow this is a moment of great distress and evil, that God is there in judgment. You might remember one of the great plagues of judgment on Egypt in the Old Testament was a plague of darkness over the whole land of Egypt. What we're meant to see here in this darkness surrounding Jesus is that God is here, and he is here, and he is angry, and he is bringing judgment. But what's that got to do with Jesus? You know, he's the Son of God. He's God himself in human form. What's all that got to do with him? Well, that's the second thing I want you to see, the cry that Jesus makes from the cross. In the next verse, Jesus says this, Mark says this, at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So here is the real pain that Jesus was experiencing on the cross. Over and above all the physical pain, here is the relational, emotional, spiritual pain that Jesus was experiencing. Being forsaken, being abandoned to death by God himself. You know, the darkness of God's anger was surrounding Jesus, the only person in world history who didn't deserve it. You know, Jesus lived the perfect life that nobody else could, and yet here he is being surrounded by God's anger. And he knew it. He felt abandoned. He felt forsaken to it. Now, we need to be careful at this point. We will miss the significance of this if we think that God's anger is like our anger. And you know what our anger is like, isn't it? There are some times when our anger is right, but so often our anger quickly leads to rage and malice and vindictiveness. You know, like when you're driving down the highway or the freeway and somebody cuts in on you, you know what you want to do. You want to wind down or press the button and the window goes down and stick your fist out and let your rage be known. But God's anger is not like that. There's no inner Hulk that just rears its ugly head in God. No, when the Bible talks about God's anger, it's his settled, controlled, righteous response to all that is evil and wrong. It's his settled hostility to all that should not be. And remember that Jesus is not some innocent third party that God is punishing mistakenly. Yes, throughout Mark's biography of Jesus, we've seen Jesus is fully man, but he is also fully God. So as the darkness of God's anger is surrounding Jesus on the cross, it's Jesus' own anger against all that is evil and wrong in the world that he is facing himself, willingly abandoning or forsaking himself to his own anger against sin and evil. Why would he do that? Why would he do that? Well, earlier in Mark's biography, Jesus said this as a great summary of why he came to this world. In Mark 10:45, Jesus says, "The Son of Man," talking about himself, "did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus willingly forsake himself to the darkness of God's anger. He willingly abandoned himself to it. He willingly endured it for you and for me, to serve us, to rescue us, to ransom us, to pay the price that we can't pay. I don't know if you remember this news story. A couple of years ago, there was a Thailand boys soccer team that were out training, and then this storm just suddenly came, and the boys went and sheltered inside a cave, and then the water started to fill up in the cave, and they moved deeper and deeper into the cave, and the cave became completely flooded, and they were just sheltering so far into the cave system on a shelf. Now, when people knew that that's where they were, they had to come up with this incredible plan to rescue them out of the cave. And the rescue plan involved these expert divers going into the cave and laying down oxygen tanks at different stages, and then divers, in the middle of the darkness, trying to teach these young boys how to scuba dive. And then they would dive through the cave, and when the air tanks would run out, they would pick up the next one that happened to be just at the right spot, and so on and so forth. But there's this incredible sacrificial story. One of the divers who was sent there to rescue these kids was so focused on his mission to lay down these oxygen tanks at different points that he was so focused on that he forgot to check his own air supply in his own tank. And as he was laying down these tanks to save the boys, he ran out of air himself, and tragically, he lost his life. It's a horrible story, really, but it's also a story of incredible sacrificial love, that he was prepared to lay down his life to save these boys that he hadn't even met. Now, I want to suggest that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was just as, if not more, gloriously loving to you and to me. You see, when Jesus died on that cross, he didn't just die for innocent bystanders caught up at the wrong place at the wrong time. Jesus stood there in your place and my place, and all people in this world who haven't loved God. We saw last week that God created us with a heart to love him and to love others, but that's not our heartbeat. If we're honest with ourselves, we know that we would prefer to call the shots in our life. In many ways, we would prefer to be God. And yet God said, I still love you. And I'm going to go into this world, live the perfect life that you can't. And then I'm going to offer myself up as a sacrifice to you to take away your sin and offer you forgiveness. That is crazy, crazy love. Jesus could still a storm with his voice, but to save you and to save me from our sin, to forgive us, that requires more than a word. That's a sacrificial work. Last week we saw Jesus could say to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." But the way that Jesus can forgive sin is in this costly sacrifice. Because you and I know that if somebody hurts us and we forgive them, what are we doing? We are saying to them, I am not going to hold my hurt and my rights for justice against you. I am going to abandon myself to that. I am going to absorb the hurt, the pain, the injustice myself, and not hold you accountable to it. That's what we're doing when we're forgiving someone. Forgiveness hurts. Forgiveness is costly. If you've ever had to forgive someone that's betrayed you, you know that it hurts and it's costly. No less for God in Jesus. Jesus can say, I forgive you, but the reason he says that he will forgive us is because he's prepared to suffer and die in our place and absorb the hurt and the pain that is rightfully ours. And if we want to know that Jesus' death on the cross was sufficient to pay for our sin, we only have to keep reading further and see the curtain, the eclipse, the cry, and now finally the curtain. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. At the exact moment that Jesus died on that cross on the hill outside Jerusalem, on the other side of the city, in the great temple of God in Jerusalem, something incredible also happened. This temple curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, if you're not familiar with the temple in Jerusalem, there were two key sections within the temple itself. There was a holy place that people could go into to offer sacrifices and worship God. But then there was another place called the most holy place that no person could go into except for the high priest of the people, who would go into that place once a year to offer a sacrifice for sin, to take away the sin of the people. And to separate the holy place from the most holy place was this thick curtain. It was 9 meters high and it was as thick as a man's hand. And Mark tells us that at the moment Jesus died on the cross, this temple curtain that basically said to people, do not enter. You cannot approach God because of your sin. Well, at the moment Jesus died, that curtain was ripped in two from top to bottom, as if God himself in heaven was tearing apart the curtain. It's almost like God is saying to the world, you can now come into my presence. You can now be my friend without fear because of what Jesus has just done. He's lived the perfect life. He has died the death that you deserve, paying for your sins fully and finally. And if you come to him, the way is open to be my friend, to live with me and enjoy a relationship with me forever. The eclipse, the cry, the curtain. You can easily miss these three things if you just quickly read the account of Jesus' death. But as we stop and we look at them in a little bit more detail, we can see that there was something so much more significant than just the physical pain that Jesus experienced on the cross. There was this cosmic, spiritual reality to Jesus' death, where he is standing in the darkness that you and I deserve for our sin, in love, sacrificing himself, abandoning himself to that darkness so that we never have to, and then opening up the way for us to enjoy life, forgiven, freedom with God forever. And so what should our response be to that? You know, throughout this One Life series, I've been talking about sharing with you the best news ever. This is the best news ever. That no matter who you are or what you've done, because of Jesus, you can now come to God, and your past doesn't need to define you. Your mistakes don't need to keep following you. There is perfect, final, sufficient forgiveness. No shame, no guilt. Jesus has taken it all away. That is the best news ever. So what should our response to that be? Well, there are a few other people in the story that we haven't quite looked at yet. And remember how I said over the last few weeks, Mark, the way that he tells his story of Jesus, really invites us in to imagine that we are there. And so I want to zoom in on some of these people in the story, and I wonder if you identify with any of them. Firstly, there's the soldiers, the soldiers that crucified, nailed Jesus to the cross. Let's see what they are doing at this time. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. The soldiers didn't notice anything cosmically significant happening at the moment Jesus dies. All they care about is the material things of the world. They're playing a game. It's not a video game, but they're playing a game, rolling a dice to see who would get the clothes of Jesus. The material things were more important than spiritual things for these men. And I think we can be like those soldiers too, can't we? There are times in life when all we care about is just the material things of this world. Video games, going to work, studying, making money, doing the gardening, tidying up the house. We get so fixated and focused on these things that we have no time to think about spiritual matters. We can be so focused on good things. Material things in this world are good things that God gives us. But we can miss the best thing that God wants us to see. And that is himself in the person of Jesus laying down his life for us. I know that I've been like that, and I'm sure that you can identify with the soldiers as well. Or maybe not the soldiers. There's also the religious leaders. Now look at what these guys are doing as Jesus is dying on the cross. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked Jesus among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. The religious leaders thought that they already knew the way to God. They didn't see any need for the cross of Christ. To them, the cross was a sign of weakness. And so they mocked Jesus. Who is this guy? He said that he could save others, but look, he can't even save himself. But the great irony in what they say there is the only way Jesus can save others is by not saving himself. Yes, Jesus could have saved himself. He did still a storm with his voice. If he wanted to step off the cross, he could have. Absolutely. He could have called down angels from heaven to rescue him if he wanted to, but he didn't, because he knew the only way to save you and to save me and to save the world was by hanging there on the cross. But the religious leaders didn't see that. They thought they were already good enough and that they didn't need Jesus to die for them, and so they mocked him. And I think we can be like that at times as well. You know, we can be so focused on maybe even living religious lives. You know, we're good people, we go to church, we sing the songs, we may even post up a Bible verse or two on Facebook, and we think that by doing these things, we are good enough for God. You know, Jesus might need to die for other people, but he doesn't need to die for me because I'm basically a good person. But we've seen over the last few weeks, that's just not true. We all have a heart problem. You know, if our life was on display on Facebook and YouTube for the world to see, there are so many things that we'd be ashamed and embarrassed by. But I think sometimes we can be blind to that like the religious leaders, and so we don't think that we need Jesus. Or there's Pontius Pilate. Now, we didn't read too much about Pontius Pilate in this story because he happened just in the section before the one that we read tonight. But I want you to have a look at what he does just before Jesus dies on the cross. Remember, this is the person who had the earthly power to free Jesus. This is what happens. Pilate says to the Jewish people who want to kill Jesus, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. It's an incredibly sad story because Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent and doesn't deserve to die. He knows it's out of self-interest, jealousy and envy that the religious leaders want Jesus to die. Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent, and yet he still hands Jesus over to be crucified. Why? Because the religious leaders had whipped up the crowd into this frenzy, crying out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd. He wanted to satisfy the crowd. His own fear of what might happen if he did the right thing, what people might think of him, overcame him and he did the wrong thing. And friends, I think we can relate to Pilate. I think we can identify with Pilate as well. You know, we do long to be recognised by others. We long for the approval of others. Our friends, our colleagues, our parents, our teachers, whoever it might be. And so often, to try and get the approval of others, we will even do something that we know deep down is wrong. We can so easily be just like Pilate. So who are you like in your response to Jesus? Is it the soldiers, the religious leaders, Pontius Pilate? Well, there's one other person that I want to show you who made a different response, and he is the one that I would love for you to make as well, and that is the Roman centurion, the one who was standing there watching everything unfold. This was his response. "And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, 'Surely this man was the Son of God.'" surely this man, in the way that he lived and the way that he has now died, he really is the Son of God. And that's the response that I think Mark wants us all not just to resonate with, but to make ourselves, to confess with our own lips, Jesus really is the Son of God who loved me and gave up his life for me. And I'd love for you to make that response by the time we get to the end of the One Life Live course. We do only live once, but it's also true we only die once, and then we have to stand before God and give an account for our life. Are you ready to meet God? Well, if you have put your trust in Jesus, if you have said to Jesus, I know I'm not perfect, I know I deserve death for my sin, but Jesus, thank you so much that you stood in my place, that you hung on that cross and you abandoned yourself to the darkness that would rightly be mine, that you took that in my place so that I never have to. Thank you so much. And he has made a way for you to be friends with God forever. If you have come to Jesus, then you can be assured that you will be ready to meet God. No matter what happens tomorrow, no matter what happens next week, next month, next year, or 20 years' time, if you have come to Jesus and said, sorry for your sin, thank you, Jesus, for dying for me and for opening up the way for me to have life with God forever, then you will be ready no matter what happens. Well, friends, that's all the content for tonight. Let me know if you have any questions about what we have talked about with respect to Jesus' death on the cross. Was there anything that you'd like further explanation there? Let me know in the comments. Or if you're watching this on the rebroadcast, please put a question there in the comments, because I do read them all and I would love to be able to help you and to answer your questions as well. So feel free to comment there. I can see Bruce has said one of his favourite video games was playing Treasure Fall. He didn't say how long he played that video game for, Bruce. I don't know how long you played that for, but yes, we all know that we can play and play and play games. But remember, as good as the material things are in life, the best thing is the spiritual reality that Jesus opens up for us because of his death on the cross. How do you feel about that? Why don't you ask me a question? Let us know, and I'd love to be able to help answer your questions. If you don't have any questions, that's okay. Continue to think about what we've been talking about, and over the next few days, put a question in the comments, and I'd love to be able to help answer them next week. There is no pre-prepared questions for this week. I think maybe everybody has been having their questions answered. Maybe. That's what I'm hoping for anyway. But over the next few days, if you have any questions about what we have talked about, don't hesitate to put a comment there, and I'd love to be able to get back to you. But friends, that's session 4. We have 2 sessions to go, 2 more Monday nights. Next week, we're going to see that there's a good news ending to the Jesus death story. Jesus didn't stay dead. He came back to life again. And I want to show you that next week. So that'll be session 5 next week. Jesus comes back to life. And we're going to see, why does that matter? What does that mean? What does that show us? And what are the implications for us today? And so we'll be exploring that together next week. And then session 6, the week after that, we're going to think about, well, what do we now need to do in response to all that we've heard about the good news story of Jesus. So thanks so much for tuning in tonight, whether that's live now or whether you're watching on the rebroadcast. Thanks again. Leave a comment there, leave a question in the comments, and I'd love to be able to answer them next week for you. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your week. Don't forget that our church has its live stream Sunday service every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. You're welcome to tune in and join us there as well. But thanks so much for listening tonight. God bless. Have a wonderful week.